How are black swans related to the internet, Harry Potter and 9/11? We will find out today in Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, The Black Swan. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and I welcome you to this book review of The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. The book was published in 2007 and it is part of a series called Incerto. It does have 5 volumes up to now and The Black Swan is the second of those. Before he started writing, Taleb was an options trader, so there is a slight focus on finances and economics in some sections of the book. So, what's up with that black swan? The black swan is used as a metaphor by Taleb. For several hundred years, people believed there are only white swans, because white swans was all we ever saw. Taleb even mentions an ancient Roman text where black swan, the phrase black swan, was used to describe something that is impossible, such as hell freezing over or pigs learning to fly. However, Australia was discovered and there are plenty of black swans. So, Taleb uses the black swan as a metaphor for a certain type of events. Events that are, first, entirely unpredictable, improbable, that are totally outside our frame of expectations. Second, events that have a great impact, unlike the bird. And third, events that are in retrospective, totally explainable and predictable. Examples are, for example, inventions such as the computer or the internet. Those were not planned in any way. Those came unexpected and had great impact. There was a nice quote from the early days of computers from an employee of IBM who said, "Oh, we will probably never need more than a handful of computers worldwide." Now that guy was totally wrong. In pop culture, Harry Potter is a nice example for a black swan. You might recall the stories of how the author Joan K. Rowling was turned down by plenty of publishers because they all said, "Oh well, this won't sell, this is much too long for a children's book, this will be a failure." And nobody expected it to be a great worldwide success. And of course, a lot of historical events are black swans. For example, the rise of the major religions. Taleb mentions that in ancient Roman texts, Christianity is barely ever mentioned because Romans didn't think it was important in any way. And the terrorist attacks of 9/11 are also a good example for a black swan, and they also show a very important point. A black swan depends on the perspective of the observer. 9/11 was a black swan for most people, but it was obviously not a black swan for the terrorists inside the plane because they knew what was going to happen, they knew what they were doing. Therefore, a black swan can also be an event in your own personal life, an event that changed your life and had great impact. For example, this time you got that job that you've been doing for several years now. Or this time you totally by chance met that person you've been in a relationship with for several years now. One final important aspect, a black swan can also be an event that everyone totally expects to happen that does not happen after all. You might recall the movie John Carter by Disney. At the time, Disney believed that this would be a great hit. There was plenty of hype and advertising. Disney thought this would be the start of another great franchise such as Star Wars. However, the movie totally failed and is by now completely forgotten. So for Disney, this was a black swan. Now that we've discussed this, we are done with the prologue, and there are 300 more pages to discuss. Because even though black swans themselves and black swans events are quite exciting, what is even more interesting for Taleb is how we deal with black swans, how we perceive black swans, because Taleb says we are not able to really perceive black swans, to really grasp the concept. And in the first part of the book, he describes why that is. And this is also the part that is most relevant to me, most interesting to me. So I will place a lot of emphasis on this part and talk about it in some detail. And the other parts of the book I will only deal with very briefly. Now, since we can't really deal with the concept of black swans, we believe we can make predictions about the future. And in the second part of the book, Taleb describes why this does not work. Finally, in the third part of the book, he describes the scientific approach to randomness and to chance. And again, I will only deal with that briefly. There is also a fourth part of the book that is very brief, that is a short conclusion to the book. And in this edition, the second edition of the book, there is an additional essay on randomness, on robustness and fragility, that has about 70 pages, and it's also quite interesting, but I won't discuss it at all in this video because we don't have unlimited time here. So we are not really able to grasp and to understand black swans. Why is that? Early in the book, Taleb establishes two metaphors. The first is Mediocristan. Mediocristan is an imaginary country where everything is explainable and predictable and everything is known. Everything is based on normal distribution, on averages. And on the other hand, we have Extremistan. And in Extremistan, we have the exceptions, the unknown, we have extremes, and in Extremistan, we also have black swans. Now, the problem is, we frequently believe we would be in Mediocristan, we would be dealing with matters from Mediocristan, when we are actually deep in Extremistan. In Mediocristan, we have a kind of uniformity. Everything is somewhat similar. If I have a large sample size, this means my results, my conclusions are more reliable because a single measurement won't drastically change my statistics. This applies, for example, if we deal with body size. Body size is something from Mediocristan. If I wonder how big is the average human, and I go out into the street, I pick 100 random people, ask them about their body size, and I create a statistic out of that. Then I will have a pretty good average, a pretty good approximation of how tall a human is. And if by chance the world's biggest person comes by and says, "Oh, I want to take part 2, please measure me as well," this won't drastically change my average and my statistic. It would be totally different if I'd be dealing with wealth, because that is something from Extremistan. If I would ask 100 random people how much money they have and would create a statistic out of that and would create an average, and then by chance the world's richest person would come by and would want to be included in that statistic, this would completely mess up the statistic. That would change the average drastically, because in comparison to the wealth of the richest person on earth, the wealth of those 100 random people would be totally neglectable. This would be a tiny fraction of the wealth of this one person. If we are considering income, then it depends on the profession. There are some professions from Mediocristan, such as, for example, being a dentist. If I am a dentist, my income is directly related to the number of patients I treat, and it is directly related to the number of hours I work. I can be an especially good dentist and well known and whatever and earn more than other dentists, but I won't be able to increase my income by a factor of 10 or by a factor of 100. On the other hand, if I am a writer, which is a profession from Extremistan, then there is scalability. It is possible to increase my income by a factor of 100 or 1000, because once I've written a book, it doesn't make any difference to me if it is read by 100 people or by 1,000,000 people. I don't have to invest additional effort or anything. So, being a writer is a profession from Extremistan, and we have scalability. So there is a chance for really large profits. However, this also means there is a great risk. If I am a writer, I might write and publish books for years and years on end and only earn peanuts all the time. And then suddenly there is this one bestseller I have, and suddenly in one book generates a larger income than my entire career up to that point. However, there is a much bigger chance, it is much more likely that I will write and publish all my life and never earn more than peanuts. Because if we have scalability, we also have winner takes all scenarios. So in writing the book market, there are a few best-selling authors that generate a large part of the total book sales, that earn a large part of the total money that is in the book market, and most of the authors earn very little. And this also means that in Mediocristan, when we have professions like being a dentist, there is a slow and steady increase over time. Income increases every year, bit by bit, while in Mediocristan, we don't have this steady development, but we have large jumps. The author doesn't earn anything for years and years, and then suddenly there is a large jump when he has that bestseller. And this is also like what historical events work like. History doesn't crawl and make slow, steady developments, but history is determined by big leaps, by big major events that have great impact, by black swans. Now, we don't like all this unpredictability, we don't like the improbable and chance, we like what we can grasp, we like confirmation, we want to learn from our experiences, which is called induction. Let's say I see a cat for the first time in my life and I say, oh, so this is a cat. I see a cat has 2 ears, 4 legs, and it has black fur. And then I see another cat and I say, oh, this cat does not have black fur, so this doesn't seem to be a major characteristic of cats, but I'm pretty sure about the 2 ears and 4 legs. And in the same way, people believed for hundreds of years that all swans are white, because white swans was all they ever saw. And here we notice a problem in induction. No matter how many additional white swans I observe, I can never prove my assumption. However, a single sighting of a black swan will mean that my assumption is false, will overthrow my assumption, and will falsify my assumption. However, in our minds, we are not really aware of that. For us, No evidence of black swans is pretty much the same as evidence of no black swans, even though those two are entirely different. Taleb gives a nice example here of a turkey. A turkey who repeatedly makes the same observation. I am fed by humans and treated very well and live a comfortable life. And this is true day after day after day for 1,000 consecutive days. And after 1,000 days, the turkey is pretty sure this is how things will go on forever. He has plenty of empirical evidence, 1,000 days. And he is quite surprised when on the 1,001st day he is butchered to become a Thanksgiving dinner. Taleb also mentions the confirmation bias here. Some of you might have heard of before, but we will discuss this in the future in a separate video. We don't only like confirmation, we also like patterns. We like if things fit together and make sense. We like stories. And Taleb calls this the narrative fallacy. I will give you a short statement in two versions. The first is, Joe seemed to have a happy marriage. He killed his wife. The second version is, Joe seemed to have a happy marriage. He killed his wife for her inheritance. At first glance, a lot of people think the second version is more likely, more probable. Because the second version has cause and effect, the second version tells a story. But actually, of course, the first version is way more likely because it doesn't narrow down the reason, and there can be plenty of possible reasons for this surprising murder. The narrative fallacy also leads us to favor anecdotes over statistics, even though statistics obviously have more weight. Taleb says we should imagine we are on a plane to New York and the guy next to us keeps talking to us, and among other things he tells us that his brother was attacked and killed in Central Park. It is quite likely that we will avoid Central Park during our stay because we have this story in the back of our minds. Oh, someone was killed, I don't want to be killed. Now, if we would have a look at actual statistics, we would probably see that first of all, it is highly unlikely to become a murder victim at all, and that the probability in Central Park is maybe just as high or low as the probability in the street where your hotel is. Because we like confirmation and we like patterns, we also like models. We like to think in categories. But here we frequently make the mistake of mistaking the model for the real world, of mistaking the map for the actual territory. But our categories are often quite simplified and to a large degree arbitrary. Taleb mentions, for example, how his home country, the Lebanon, was in the past considered to be part of the Eastern Mediterranean. Nowadays, it is considered part of the Middle East, which are both quite arbitrary categories. Nothing changed. No one digged up the country and placed it somewhere else. Someone drew some random arbitrary borders here. And this Taleb calls Platonification, after the Greek philosopher Plato. Because we focus so much on the known and on confirmation and on what we see, we tend to ignore the unknown. For example, we ignore silent evidence. Taleb tells a short fable about one Diagoras in ancient Rome, and Diagoras didn't believe in the gods, and the people around him wanted to change his mind, so they showed him pictures, portraits of people who had prayed and who had afterwards survived a shipwreck. But Diagoras wasn't impressed by that. He said, oh well, this is fine, but where are the portraits of those people who prayed and then drowned? And this exactly is silent evidence. The people who have drowned, who are not able to come back and say, oh well, I prayed as well, but I died. Another nice example for this are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet, but for a long time historians believed the Phoenicians didn't have any literature because archaeologists never found any. And later it turned out the Phoenicians did in fact have literature, but they used a kind of papyrus that does not last long enough to become archaeological findings. We actually discussed the matter of silent evidence earlier in the video about role models. You remember the symmetry of the failed, the phenomenon that we only see those people who are successful because they are in the limelight, and we ignore all of those people who tried but failed. If we ever deal with randomness and with chance at all, then we usually focus on games. We focus on things like gambling, on laboratory experiments. So we focus on a kind of randomness that is tamed and domesticated, where the boundary conditions are all known. And this has nothing in common with real randomness, real chance, real unpredictability. This Taleb calls the ludic fallacy. So the conclusion is we have a kind of tunnel vision. We see certain things and we place great emphasis on certain things, but there are a lot of other things that we ignore, that we don't really recognize, that we are not really aware of. Now you might wonder if this is something that just happens to the average person, but not to the expert. But according to Taleb, experts make just as many mistakes here as the average person. Experts are not better at all. A lot of experts are, as Taleb says, pretty much just frauds. He uses the phrase empty suits for that. In the second part of the book, Taleb describes why predictions do not work. As I said, I will only deal with that briefly. One aspect I found interesting is, again, about our perceptions. If we made a prediction and this turns out to be wrong because there is a great big event, a black swan, we tend to say, oh well, my prediction was totally fine. No one could have known this. So for example, my investment plan was totally fine and sound and everything. No one could have known there would be a financial crisis. I did well. Destiny did not play by the rules. I find this quite interesting. And another interesting aspect is that we tend to ignore the error rate. Often an error rate is not included, or we don't place great emphasis on it, even though it can be more important than the prediction itself. It makes a great difference. If I say the costs will be around $5,000, give or take 100, or if I say give or take 3,000. And finally, one other point I found interesting is that we can't ever really predict the development of history, because then we would also have to predict technological developments. And if I would be able to predict inventions made in a year or whatever, I would be able to make them right now, so the prediction would end up being meaningless. Taleb gives a simple example here. If I would be certain today that in a week I will know that my partner has an affair, then I would react to this now and not in a week, and so this whole prediction business would come tumbling down. In the third part, Taleb deals with the approach the science take to randomness and to chance. I will only deal with that again very briefly. I just want to point out the general direction Taleb takes here. He describes that scientists, statisticians, mathematicians, economists base their predictions, base their thoughts on the so-called normal distribution, on the bell curve by Carl Friedrich Gauss. This basically says that there is an average, and the further away you move from that average, the more unlikely things become. And this is a concept that, according to Taleb, does not work for real unpredictability, for real randomness. And he proposes another model by Benoit Mandelbrot. Mandelbrot developed fractal geometry. And the theories behind fractal geometry can also be applied to randomness, and according to Taleb, this is a much better approach. So let's proceed to the critique. I find this book quite exciting, quite interesting. I like this topic of perception, about dealing with the way we think, the way we perceive things, where there are blind spots, where there are things we can't really deal with properly. This is quite an interesting topic that we will deal with further on this channel, so Taleb will probably make other appearances here. The book also deals with questions of statistics and mathematics, and I don't really have the expertise to comment on those in detail. Now this begs the question, how complicated, how complex is this book? Now this is a bit difficult. On one hand, the book is well written and it is easy to read and it is fun to read and I enjoyed it, but on the other hand, it does deal with complex topics. There are a lot of scientific terms, there are a lot of names, a lot of complex concepts, so it is not that easy to understand. For example, Taleb calls himself an epistemic skeptic, which basically means that he deals with knowledge on a meta level, that he does not deal with the content of knowledge, but he deals with questions such as where does this knowledge come from, how was it generated, is it trustworthy, and things like that. So often things are a bit abstract. There is a short warning ahead of some sections where Taleb says, yeah, this section is a bit technical. If you are not interested in the technical details, you can skip it. But in general, the book isn't that easy to understand. And of course, it is a rather long book, about 400 pages. So this is not a quick read. The book is mainly based on philosophical considerations, on logical arguments, so there aren't plenty of studies or statistics. One point where I would have liked to have some more is the question, if our predictions do not work, is it still better to use them than to have nothing at all? Here Taleb says, we shouldn't use them, they cause more harm than good, but I would really like to have some more statistics, some more details about that, because it also seems to be a point that is frequently stressed by his critics. Speaking about his critics, there is of course some conflict about the book and about Taleb's theories, because Taleb basically says about statisticians and economists, your work is useless, you cause more harm than good, you should better pick a different profession and stop doing what you are doing altogether. And of course, statisticians and economists and so on don't agree, so they in turn criticize Taleb, claim he just hasn't understood statistics properly, things like that. and I don't have the expertise to really to really judge who is right on which points. Occasionally, Taleb has a bit of an other people are stupid attitude. There are some people he highly praises, such as Mandelbrot. Others he criticizes a lot. But I wasn't a problem for me. This edition is very nice. The text could be a bit bigger, but it is already a rather large book, so it's all right. It is nice and flexible, so I can certainly recommend this edition, and I can certainly recommend the book. It is quite interesting, and in the book you will find a lot of further topics and aspects and interesting things, because in this video I was barely able to scratch the surface, since it has a lot of material. If you've watched this far, you have probably enjoyed the video, so I would certainly appreciate a like, and I would appreciate if you subscribe to the channel and visit it more often in the future. We will see each other again next week in the next channel update. For today I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.